Some truths are so dangerous that even good people work to suppress them. I wrote that letter on the margins of a newspaper because I had no other paper. 8 white clergymen had published a statement calling my presence in Birmingham unwise and untimely. They were not Klansmen. They were ministers, rabbis, decent men who considered themselves moderate. They wanted order. They wanted patience. They wanted us to wait. But their letter revealed something more dangerous than hatred. The lie that time alone heals injustice. That lie had sustained segregation longer than violence ever could. It allowed good people to do nothing and call it wisdom. It made cruelty comfortable. What I wrote back was not a political document. It was an explanation of why the word wait had become indistinguishable from never, and why the real extremists were not those demanding justice, but those demanding we be patient with its absence. Before we continue, take a moment to notice where you're listening from, and if this story stays with you, you are welcome to return tomorrow for what comes next. The letter didn't begin with my arrest. It began years earlier, when I first believed that good white people would choose justice once they understood. I was 26 when the people of Montgomery asked me to lead the bus boycott. Young, educated. I had a doctorate from Boston University. I'd studied Hegel and Kant, read Thoreau and Gandhi. I believed in the power of moral argument, in the inherent goodness of reasonable people. I thought that if we demonstrated our dignity, if we suffered without retaliation, if we appealed to conscience and Christian love, the white moderates would stand with us. That was 1955. By 1963, I knew better. The boycott lasted 381 days. We walked to work, we carpooled, we organized with a precision that would have impressed any military operation, and we won. The Supreme Court ruled segregated buses unconstitutional. It felt like vindication, like proof that nonviolent resistance worked, that America's better angels could be summoned through moral clarity. But I watched what happened next. I watched how quickly the victory was absorbed, how rapidly it became comfortable again for moderate whites to return to their ordinary lives. The buses were integrated, yes, but the schools remained separate. The lunch counters remained divided. The voting registrars remained hostile. And the good white people, the ones who had quietly supported us or at least not opposed us, they seemed satisfied. One battle won. Time to rest. Time to let things settle. And that's when I began to understand the deeper pattern. The white moderate didn't oppose equality in principle. He opposed the disruption that equality required. He could accept change, but only if it came slowly, quietly, without demanding anything from him personally. He could support justice in the abstract while opposing every concrete action that might achieve it. March, too confrontational. Boycott, economic terrorism. Sit-in, provocative. Every method we tried was deemed inappropriate by those who claimed to be on our side. I remember the conversation I had in 1958 with a white minister in Atlanta, a good man who genuinely believed himself sympathetic to our cause. We sat in his study surrounded by books on theology and ethics. He told me he admired what we were trying to do. He said he believed segregation was wrong. Then he said, "But Martin, you have to understand that you can't force these things. You have to give people time to adjust. You have to work within the system." I asked him how much time. He didn't have an answer, just more time, always more time. That word, Time. I heard it everywhere, from politicians who promised gradual progress, from journalists who counseled patience, from clergy who preached reconciliation without justice. Time became the answer to every demand, the solution to every grievance. Just wait, just give it time, as if injustice were a crop that would ripen on its own rather than a system that had to be dismantled by human hands. But I knew what time meant for the people I served. I knew what it meant for Mrs. Parks, who still couldn't eat at most restaurants in Montgomery. I knew what it meant for the children I saw growing up in schools with broken windows and outdated textbooks while white children attended institutions that looked like palaces. I knew what it meant for the men who came to me unable to vote despite the 15th Amendment being nearly 90 years old. Time for them meant watching their lives pass while waiting for white people to feel ready. By 1962, I'd been arrested multiple times. I'd been stabbed by a disturbed woman in Harlem. I'd seen mobs throw rocks at children trying to attend school. I'd watched police turn dogs and fire hoses on peaceful protesters. And through it all, the white moderates' response remained consistent. This is unfortunate, but you must be patient. The disconnect was staggering. They saw our methods as extreme while viewing Bull Connor's tactics as mere excess. They worried more about the disruption of protests than the violence of segregation. They treated our urgency as impatience, our moral claims as emotional overreach. I began to see that the white moderate wasn't an ally waiting to be activated. He was an obstacle that had to be understood and confronted. This understanding shaped everything about the Birmingham campaign. We didn't go to Birmingham naively. We went knowing that we would be arrested, knowing that we would be called outside agitators, knowing that we would be told our timing was wrong. We went because Birmingham was perhaps the most segregated city in America, because its commissioner of public safety was a man who believed in meeting protests with maximum force, and because we knew that forcing a crisis was the only way to compel negotiation. We scheduled the campaign carefully. We trained hundreds of people in nonviolent resistance. We prepared for economic boycotts. We coordinated with local black leaders who had been fighting this battle long before we arrived. We anticipated every objection, every call for patience, every plea to wait. And still, when I was arrested on Good Friday, the 12th of April, 1963, for defying an injunction against protest, I was not prepared for what came next. In jail, someone slipped me a copy of the Birmingham News. There on the page was a statement from 8 white Alabama clergymen, not segregationists, not Klan members, clergymen, a Catholic priest, a rabbi, an Episcopal bishop, Methodist and Baptist ministers, men of God. They called our demonstrations unwise and untimely. They praised the police for their restraint. They urged the black community to withdraw support from the protest and negotiate privately with white business leaders. They said that rights should be pursued in the courts, not in the streets. They acknowledged that social injustices existed, but insisted that these could be worked out through patient negotiation. I read it sitting on a metal cot in a cell designed for isolation. The words were measured, reasonable concern. They expressed no hatred. They claimed goodwill. They positioned themselves as moderate voices of reason against both segregationists and protesters. And in that moment, sitting in that jail, I saw the entire architecture of the lie laid bare. These were not evil men. That was precisely the problem. They were good men, respected men, men who believed they were serving God and promoting peace. And yet everything they wrote served to preserve the system that kept my people in chains. They didn't have to be cruel. They didn't have to hate. All they had to do was prefer order to justice, process to rights, gradualism to immediate change. All they had to do was prioritize their comfort over our freedom. The lie wasn't that segregation was good. The lie was that it would end on its own if everyone just remained calm and patient. The lie was that there was a right way to protest injustice, a way that wouldn't disturb anyone, wouldn't create tension, wouldn't demand immediate action. The lie was that time was neutral, that it would carry us toward justice without anyone having to sacrifice or struggle or risk. But time is not neutral. Time perpetuates the existing order unless people actively intervene to change it. Every day that passed in patience was another day of humiliation, another day of denied dignity, another day that children learned to accept subjugation as normal. The 8th clergyman's letter reveals something I'd suspected but never seen stated so clearly. The greatest barrier to black freedom was not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate who valued order over justice, who preferred a negative peace, the absence of tension, to a positive peace, the presence of justice. I began to write my response on the margins of that newspaper. I had no other paper. The gods wouldn't provide any. So I wrote in the spaces between articles, continued on scraps that my lawyer smuggled in, composed in my head during the hours when I had nothing to write on at all. I wasn't writing to convince the 8 clergymen. I knew they wouldn't change. I was writing to expose the logic they represented, to show how reasonable sounding arguments could serve unreasonable ends, to demonstrate why patience had become indistinguishable from complicity. I wrote for the white moderates across America who believed themselves sympathetic, who thought they supported civil rights but opposed our methods. I wrote to show them that their position was not neutral, that their calls for patience were not kind, that their preference for gradual change was indistinguishable from support for the status quo. Most of all, I wrote to dismantle the lie that had sustained segregation longer than any law, the lie that time heals injustice, that progress happens naturally, that waiting is a form of wisdom rather than a form of surrender. That letter would become known as the letter from Birmingham jail. But to me, it was simply the clearest statement I could make about why we could not wait, why direct action was morally necessary, and why the white moderates' call for patience was the most insidious obstacle we faced. The truth I wrote on those newspaper margins would expose America's biggest lie. Not the lie of the segregationist who hated, the lie of the moderate who claimed to care but demanded we be patient without oppression. That lie had to be named. It had to be dismantled. And I had nothing but time, a jail cell, and the margins of a newspaper to do it. The act of writing that letter changed something in me that I hadn't anticipated. I'd written speeches before. I'd written sermons, articles, entire books, but this was different. This wasn't for a crowd or a congregation. This was me, alone in a cell, speaking directly to the moral evasion I'd spent years trying to understand. The first lines came easily. I explained why I was in Birmingham, why we couldn't wait, why direct action was necessary. I wrote about the difference between just and unjust law. I quoted Augustine and Aquinas, showed that our position stood on centuries of moral philosophy, not emotional outbursts. But as I continued, something unexpected happened. The writing began to reveal things I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. I wrote about my disappointment in the white moderate, and as the words took shape, I realized the depth of that disappointment. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief. I had genuinely believed that educated, religious white people would recognize injustice and act against it. I had believed in their stated values. Their failure wasn't just political, it was personal. I wrote about being called an extremist, and in defending that charge, I found myself reframing the entire question. Yes, I was an extremist. Jesus was an extremist for love. Amos was an extremist for justice. Paul was an extremist for the gospel. The question wasn't whether to be an extremist, but what kind of extremist to be. Would we be extremists for hate or for love, for preservation of injustice, or for its destruction? The clergyman had tried to position themselves as a reasonable middle between segregationists and civil rights activists, but there was no moral middle between oppression and freedom. Their moderation was just a disguise for choosing the oppressor's side while maintaining the appearance of virtue. I wrote about the white church, and here the pain was sharpest. I'd been raised in the church. My father was a minister. I devoted my life to Christian service. I believed that the church of all institutions would stand for justice. Instead, I'd watched it become the most segregated hour of the week. I'd seen it preach love on Sunday and practice discrimination on Monday. I'd heard it counsel patience with evil while claiming to worship a God of righteousness. The words came faster as I wrote about this. I could see the faces of white ministers who had turned us away from their churches. I could remember the silence from pulpits that should have thundered with moral clarity. I could feel the weight of knowing that the institution that claimed to follow Christ had become one of the strongest defenders of the system that crucified his children. I wrote that I'd wept over the laxity of the church, and it was true. I had wept, not dramatic tears for effect, but the quiet grief of someone watching an institution betray its purpose. But the most difficult part to write was about time itself. The clergyman had said we should wait. They'd said it as if it were wisdom, but I needed to explain why that word had become unbearable. I thought of my daughter. She was 6 years old. I thought of having to explain to her why she couldn't go to the public amusement park advertised on television. I thought of watching her develop a bitterness toward white people because she was beginning to understand that her skin color meant she was considered inferior. I thought of my son asking why white people treat colored people so mean. How do you answer that? How do you tell a child that the cruelty he experiences is systematic, intentional, supported by law and custom and the silence of good people? I wrote about these moments because they made time concrete. Time wasn't an abstract concept. It was my children growing up learning to accept degradation. It was families broken by economic oppression. It was men and women denied the basic dignity of being addressed by their names and titles, always boy or girl, regardless of age or accomplishment. When someone said wait, they were asking my daughter to wait for the dignity that white children received at birth. They were asking my son to be patient with humiliation. They were asking an entire people to postpone their humanity. I tried to make the clergymen understand this through the letter. I tried to show them that their timeline was easy because they weren't the ones suffering. They could afford to wait because waiting cost them nothing. But for us, every day of waiting was another day of injury. As I wrote, I became aware that I was doing something more than responding to a newspaper article. I was creating a record of our reasoning, a document that would show future generations why we couldn't be patient, why we had to act, why moderation was moral cowardice dressed in reasonable language. The gods moved me between cells during the writing. Sometimes I had light, sometimes not. Sometimes I could write, sometimes I could only compose in my head, holding entire paragraphs in memory until I had paper again. The physical discomfort of jail, the isolation, the uncertainty about when I'd be released, all of it fed into what I was writing. Because this was the point, this was what direct action meant. It meant accepting suffering to expose injustice. It meant making the comfortable uncomfortable. It meant forcing a crisis that would compel negotiation. The clergymen wanted us to negotiate without pressure, but that's not how power works. Those who benefit from injustice don't surrender privilege voluntarily. They must be forced to recognize that maintaining the system has become more costly than changing it. That's why we fill the jails. That's why we marched knowing we'd be arrested. That's why we accepted violence without retaliating. We were creating a situation that couldn't be ignored, that demanded response, that made neutrality impossible. I wrote about this in the letter, explaining our strategy of nonviolent direct action. We didn't create the tension. The tension already existed. We simply made it visible. We brought the hidden violence of segregation into the open where it could be treated. The clergymen praised the Birmingham police for their restraint in handling the protest. I wrote about this with particular care. They saw restraint. I saw men who had beaten protesters, who had arrested children, who enforced laws designed to humiliate and oppress. The clergymen could see restraint because they measured the police against the worst possible behavior. But we measured them against justice, and by that standard, every peaceful enforcement of an unjust law was violence. And this was a fundamental gap. The clergymen judged our methods against an ideal of order. We judged the entire system against an ideal of justice. They wanted peace without disruption. We wanted righteousness even if it required conflict. I thought about what would happen when the letter was published, if it was published. Would it change anyone's mind? Would the white moderate read it and recognize himself? Would the church examine its complicity? I doubted it. Most people don't change because of arguments. They change because circumstances force them to reconsider. But I wrote anyway, because some would read it and understand, and because even if they didn't, the act of stating our position clearly mattered. We weren't asking for sympathy. We weren't begging for rights. We were declaring that we would no longer accept subjugation, that we would disrupt order until justice was established, that we would fill the jails and crowd the streets and make the system face the cost of maintaining apartheid. The letter was becoming longer than I'd intended. Usually I wrote with economy, cutting unnecessary words, but this needed to be comprehensive. Every argument the moderate used to counsel patience had to be addressed. Every excuse for inaction had to be dismantled. Every call for gradual change had to be exposed as a defense of the status quo. I wrote knowing that I was fighting more than the 8 clergymen. I was fighting the entire structure of American self-deception, the comfortable myth that the country was steadily improving, that all we needed was time and goodwill. But goodwill without action is worthless, and time without human intervention perpetuates evil. As I neared what I thought might be the end of the letter, I realized I'd created something that went beyond response. I'd created a moral argument for why patience with injustice is itself a form of injustice. I'd shown why the moderate's position, however well-intentioned, served the oppressor. The letter wouldn't convince everyone, but it would make it harder to claim ignorance. It would make the choice clear. You were either for justice now or you were for injustice continuing. There was no middle ground. No matter how reasonable it sounded, I set down the pen, a pencil, or whatever instrument I'd managed to acquire that day. My hand ached. My back hurt from the cut. But the letter was nearly complete. And somewhere in the writing, I'd found clarity about what we were fighting. Not just segregation, the lie that allowed good people to preserve it. I was released from jail on the 20th of April, 1963, after 8 days. The letter went with me, scattered across smuggled scraps of paper that my lawyers had carefully preserved. What I didn't anticipate was the response from within our own movement. Some of my closest advisors questioned whether I should publish it at all. The letter was long, they said. It was dense with theological and philosophical references. It might seem too academic, too removed from the immediate struggle. And most concerning to them, it was harsh toward people we might need as allies. I understood their worry. We were fighting a campaign that required coalition building. We needed moderate whites, even reluctant ones, to pressure businesses and politicians. Alienating them with criticism might weaken our position. But I'd written the letter precisely because that logic had trapped us for too long. We'd been so careful not to offend potential allies that we'd muted our truth. We'd accepted the framing that our demands were the problem, not the injustice we protested. We'd let the conversation center on our methods rather than on the system we opposed. One of my colleagues, a man I respected deeply, sat with me in the SCLC office in Atlanta after my release. He'd read the letter. He looked troubled. "Martin, I understand your frustration," he said, "but calling the white moderate the greatest obstacle to Negro progress, that's going to hurt us. These are people who vote. They donate. They can be brought around." "Can they?" I asked. "We've been trying to bring them around for years. They agree with our goals in principle, but oppose every action we take to achieve them. At what point do we acknowledge that their support is conditional on us never actually disrupting anything?" He shifted in his chair. "There's a difference between acknowledging that and saying it publicly. Strategy requires compromise. Compromise with what? With people who want us to be patient with our own oppression. With churches that preach brotherhood but practice segregation. I'm tired of compromising our truth for strategy that never delivers change." The conversation continued like this, circular and tense. He wasn't wrong about the political calculation, but I had moved past political calculation. I'd seen too many negotiations that went nowhere. Too many promises of gradual change that never materialized. Too many calls for patience that meant indefinite delay. The letter had to be published because the lie had to be exposed. The white moderate's position seemed reasonable only if you didn't examine it closely. Under scrutiny, it collapsed into a defense of injustice dressed in the language of prudence. But my colleagues' concerns reflected a real tension within the movement. We had people who believed in careful, incremental progress through negotiation. We had people who wanted militant confrontation. We had people who thought nonviolence was a tactic and people who thought it was a moral absolute. Holding these factions together required me to be many things to many people. The letter threatened that balance. It was uncompromising. It named the white moderate as an obstacle, the white church as complicit, the calls for patience as moral evasion. It would alienate some whites who considered themselves sympathetic. It might embolden those in our movement who wanted to abandon nonviolence entirely. I thought about this late at night, sitting in my home in Atlanta. Coretta was asleep, the children were asleep. I sat with the scattered pages of the letter now typed and assembled into a coherent document, and I wondered if I was making the right choice. The easier path would be to file it away, to let it remain a private expression of frustration rather than a public challenge. We could continue building coalitions, accepting incremental gains, working within the system. It hadn't delivered freedom, but it had delivered some progress. Maybe that was enough. But I thought about the children, not just my own, but all the black children growing up in a country that told them they were less than human. I thought about the parents trying to explain why their children couldn't use the same water fountains, sit in the same restaurants, attend the same schools as white children. I thought about the daily accumulation of small humiliations that crushed the spirit. And I thought about what it would mean to tell those children to wait, to tell them that their dignity could be postponed for the comfort of white moderates, to tell them that the timeline for their freedom was determined by how quickly white people felt ready to grant it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't ask another generation to be patient with injustice while we pursued strategy that prioritized not offending those who benefited from the system. The letter had to be published. Whatever political cost it carried, truth had to be spoken. But the conflict wasn't just external. It was internal too. I believed in nonviolence. I'd committed my life to it. I'd studied Gandhi, read Thoreau, absorbed the Christian teaching of turning the other cheek. I believed that meeting hate with love, violence with peace, was both morally right and strategically effective. But I also felt rage. I felt it when I saw children brutalized by police. I felt it when I heard about murders that went unpunished. I felt it when I sat across from white officials who smiled and made promises they had no intention of keeping. The discipline of nonviolence required me to channel that rage into constructive action rather than retaliation. But the rage was real, and there were moments when I questioned whether restraint was wisdom or weakness. The letter touched on this too. I wrote about tension being necessary, about creating crises to force negotiations, but I was careful to distinguish between nonviolent tension and violence. That distinction mattered to me philosophically and theologically, but I knew others in the movement were less certain about it. I'd heard younger activists question whether nonviolence was surrender disguised as strategy. I'd seen the appeal of black nationalism growing, the argument that we should stop appealing to white conscience and start building black power. I understood the frustration that drove those arguments. And sometimes late at night, I wondered if they were right, if the white moderate would never change through moral persuasion, if the system was too entrenched to be reformed through peaceful pressure, if we were deluding ourselves thinking that suffering could awaken the conscience of those who benefited from our subjugation. But then I'd remember what violence would mean. Not abstract violence, but concrete, specific violence. It would mean giving authorities justification for total suppression. It would mean confirming every racist stereotype. It would mean losing the moral high ground that made some whites uncomfortable with defending segregation. More than that, it would mean becoming what we opposed. The system dehumanized us. It treated us as less than human, as objects to be controlled and exploited. If we responded with violence, we'd be accepting that dehumanization, acting as if the only language available was force. Nonviolence was an assertion of our humanity. It said we would not be reduced to violence even when violence was used against us. It said we claimed the moral authority that the system denied us. But maintaining that position required extraordinary discipline from people who had every reason to abandon it. It required asking people to accept suffering they didn't deserve, to absorb violence without retaliation, to love those who hated them. Sometimes I wondered if I had the right to ask that, if it was fair to counsel nonviolence from a position of relative safety, while others bore the immediate cost. I'd been arrested, beaten, threatened, but I also had education, prominence, some degree of protection. The people in the streets, especially the young ones, they faced the most direct violence with the fewest resources. The letter addressed this indirectly when I wrote about tension and crisis. I was trying to explain that nonviolent direct action wasn't passive, it was confrontational. It deliberately created situations that forced response. It accepted suffering as a tool to expose injustice, not as an end in itself. But I knew that explanation wouldn't satisfy everyone. Some would read the letter and see it as too militant. Others would read it and see it as too restrained. The moderate position I was trying to articulate between passive acceptance and violent resistance satisfied no one completely. My wife understood this better than most. One evening after the letter had been typed, but before we decided about publication, she read it carefully. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression I recognized, a mix of pride and concern. "You know, this will make things harder," she said. "I know, not just politically, personally. You're naming powerful people as obstacles. You're challenging the church. You're telling white moderates they're part of the problem. They won't forgive that easily." "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm asking for honesty." She nodded slowly. "And our family? What happens when the threats increase? When the criticism gets worse? When people who might have protected you decide you've gone too far?" These weren't abstract questions. We lived with threats. Our house had been bombed during the Montgomery boycott. We received hate mail constantly. Our children couldn't play outside without us worrying about their safety. Publishing the letter would intensify all of that. It would mark me as someone who wouldn't be appeased or managed. It would make me a bigger target. I've thought about that. I said, I think about it every day. But if I don't speak truth now, when will I? How can I ask others to risk everything while I calculate how to stay safe? She didn't argue, she understood. But I saw the cost in her face. The weight of knowing that principle would be paid for in fear and danger. The internal conflict wasn't between believing in the letter's message and doubting it. It was between knowing it needed to be said and knowing what saying it would cost. Between commitment to truth and responsibility to family. Between the role I'd accepted as a leader and the private person who wanted to protect those I love. I chose to publish. But I made that choice knowing it would bring consequences I couldn't control, that it would mark a point of no return in my relationship with the white establishment, that it would demand even more from a movement already stretched to its limits. The letter from Birmingham jail would go out into the world, and I would have to live with what came after. The letter was published in June 1963, first in portions in various newspapers, then in full in Christian Century magazine, and in a pamphlet by the American Friends Service Committee. The response told me I'd been right about what needed to be said, even if I hadn't anticipated exactly how it would be received. White moderates reacted defensively as expected. Some claimed I'd mischaracterized their position. Others said I was being divisive at a time that required unity. A few acknowledged the criticism but insisted they were different, that they genuinely supported civil rights, that I'd been too broad in my condemnation. But something else happened that I hadn't fully anticipated. Young people, black and white, seized on the letter as an explanation for what they'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. They passed it around college campuses, read it aloud in churches, used it to explain why they were joining sit-ins and freedom rides despite their parents' concern. The letter gave them language for their urgency. It validated their impatience. It showed them that the adults counseling caution weren't wiser, just more willing to accept delay. I received letters from young activists thanking me for naming what they'd experienced. One young woman from Mississippi wrote that she'd been told by her own family to wait, to let older people negotiate, to trust the process. The letter, she said, helped her understand that waiting was surrender disguised as wisdom. That response revealed something I'd been moving toward but hadn't fully grasped. The white moderate wasn't just an obstacle to our freedom. He was the mechanism by which the system perpetuated itself without appearing overtly cruel. Segregation could have been maintained through pure force, and in many places it was, but force is expensive. It requires constant vigilance, brutal suppression, visible violence, and visible violence creates martyrs, generates sympathy, makes the oppressor look monstrous. The white moderate provided a better solution. He acknowledged that segregation was wrong in principle. He expressed sympathy for those it harmed. He claimed to support eventual change, but he always found reasons why any specific action toward change was premature, too disruptive, strategically unwise. This position allowed segregation to continue while maintaining the illusion of moral progress. It let white people feel good about themselves without actually doing anything. It shifted responsibility from the oppressor to the oppressed, suggesting that if we just approached the problem more carefully, more patiently, more reasonably, change would come. The genius of this lie was that it couldn't be easily disproven. When change didn't come, the moderate could always claim we hadn't waited long enough, hadn't been patient enough, hadn't built enough goodwill. The timeline was infinitely adjustable because it was never tied to any actual commitment. I began to see this pattern everywhere, not just in race relations. It was how power always protected itself when it couldn't rely on naked force. It co-opted the language of progress while blocking actual progress. It expressed sympathy while maintaining structure. It promised eventual change while ensuring that eventual never arrived. The clergyman's letter had been a perfect example. They'd acknowledged injustice. They'd praised civil rights as a goal, but they'd opposed every method we had for achieving it. Direct action, too confrontational. Legal challenges, too slow, but also somehow too fast. Political pressure, divisive. Everything we tried was inappropriate according to them. And if we'd accepted their framing, if we'd agreed to wait for the right time and the right method, we'd have waited forever. Because the right time, from their perspective, was never the right method, was one that didn't disturb anyone, which meant it was no method at all. Understanding this changed how I saw our entire struggle. We weren't just fighting segregation. We were fighting the mechanisms that made people comfortable with segregation. We were fighting the language that made oppression seem reasonable, that made injustice seem like a problem requiring careful management rather than immediate remedy. The letter had exposed that language. It had shown how calls for patience served power, how concerns about timing preserve the status quo, how appeals to process block progress. But exposing the lie wasn't the same as defeating it. The moderate position remained powerful precisely because it seemed reasonable. It appealed to people's desire for order, their discomfort with conflict, their belief that problems could be solved through rational discussion rather than confrontation. I saw this in meetings with white religious leaders after the letter was published. They'd read it. Some had been moved by it, but they still struggled to accept its implications. One Methodist minister met with me in Atlanta. He was genuinely troubled by segregation. He'd preached against it in his suburban congregation. He donated to civil rights organizations, and he was hurt by my criticism of the white church. I understand your frustration, Martin, he said, but you have to acknowledge that some of us are trying. We are working from within the system to change hearts and minds. That takes time. How much time? I asked. Your denomination officially opposed slavery in the 1800s. 100 years later, your churches are still segregated. How much time does changing hearts and minds require? He looked uncomfortable. These things are complicated. You can't force people to change faster than they're ready to change. But that's exactly the point. You're prioritizing their comfort over our freedom. You're saying they have the right to take as long as they want, to recognize our humanity. I'm saying that lasting change requires winning people over, not just forcing compliance. And I'm saying that while you wait for their hearts to change, real people are suffering real harm. Every day you spend trying to make segregationists comfortable with change is another day that children learn they are inferior, that families are destroyed, that dignity is denied. He didn't have a response to that, or rather he had the same response as always. I understand, but we must be patient. We must build consensus. We must not move faster than people are ready to accept. That conversation crystallized something for me. The white moderate genuinely believed he was helping. He thought his caution was prudent, his counseling of patience was wise. His concern about alienating potential allies was strategic. He couldn't see that his position was functionally identical to opposition. Couldn't see that delay was denial. Couldn't see that his calls for patience were indistinguishable from the segregationist insistence on never. The difference was that the segregationist was honest about his opposition. He didn't pretend to support civil rights while blocking every path to achieving them. He didn't claim moral authority while defending immoral systems. The moderate, with his good intentions and careful reasoning, was more dangerous precisely because he seemed reasonable. He provided cover for the system. He made it possible for good people to support oppression while believing themselves enlightened. This realization settled into something close to peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of clarity. I understood what we were fighting now, not just in abstract terms, but in precise mechanical terms. We were fighting a lie that had been carefully constructed to make injustice sustainable. A lie that said change required consensus from those who benefited from the current system. A lie that made the oppressor's comfort more important than the oppressor's freedom. A lie that transformed moral questions into matters of timing and process. And we were fighting it with the only tool that worked, making the cost of maintaining the lie higher than the cost of abandoning it. That's what direct action did. It didn't convince people through argument. It created situations where neutrality became impossible, where the moderates' carefully maintained position collapsed under the weight of visible injustice. When Bull Connor turned fire hoses on children, when police beat peaceful protesters, when jails filled with people whose only crime was demanding dignity, the moderate's position became untenable. He could no longer claim that time would solve the problem, that patience was wisdom, that gradual change was sufficient. He had to choose: support the protesters or support the system. There was no middle ground once the violence was visible, once the moral cost of delay was undeniable. That's what Birmingham had accomplished. That's what the letter had articulated. We'd forced the crisis. We'd made the invisible visible. We'd refused to let the comfortable lie remain comfortable. And we'd shown that the greatest obstacle wasn't the obvious enemy. It was the friend who agreed with our goals but opposed our methods, the ally who supported our cause but demanded we pursue it in ways that guaranteed failure, the moderate who wanted justice in theory but injustice in practice. I thought about the 8 clergymen who prompted the letter. They were still in Birmingham, still preaching in their churches, still counseling patience and order. The letter hadn't changed them. I hadn't expected it to, but it had changed the conversation. It had made it harder to claim moral authority while defending immoral delay. It had exposed the logic that made good people complicit in evil. Some would read the letter and recognize themselves. Most wouldn't. But they'd have to work harder to maintain their position. They'd have to explain why patience was still wise when children were being brutalized. They'd have to justify why process mattered more than people. And for those watching, especially the young people who hadn't yet accepted the lie as inevitable, the letter provided an alternative framework. It showed them that urgency wasn't impatience, that direct action wasn't extremism, that demanding immediate justice wasn't unreasonable. It showed them that the biggest lie in America wasn't that segregation was good. It was that segregation would end on its own if everyone just remained calm and patient and reasonable. That lie had sustained oppression for 100 years after slavery ended. It had allowed good people to do nothing while calling it wisdom. It had made cruelty comfortable by insisting that the problem was those who protested it, not those who perpetrated it. The letter had named that lie, had shown its mechanism, had demonstrated why it had to be rejected completely. What came after would determine whether that rejection mattered, whether exposing the lie was enough to dismantle it, whether America could face the truth it had been avoiding. I didn't know the answer, but I knew we'd reached a point where the lie couldn't survive unchanged. Something had to give, and I was prepared to keep pushing until it did. The Birmingham campaign ended in May 1963 with an agreement to desegregate downtown stores and release imprisoned protesters. It wasn't total victory. The agreement was partial. Implementation was slow and violence continued. But something had shifted. The letter outlived the campaign. It circulated beyond what I'd imagined. It was reprinted in magazines, included in collections, taught in school. People who'd never heard of the Birmingham protest knew the letter. That circulation did something I hadn't fully anticipated. It created a reference point. When moderates counseled patience, activists could point to the letter and say, this is what you're really asking. When white churches remained silent on injustice, members could cite the letter's criticism and demand accountability. When politicians praised gradualism, organizers could expose that position using the framework the letter provided. The lie didn't disappear, but it became harder to maintain invisibly. I saw this in concrete ways over the following years. The March on Washington happened 3 months after Birmingham. 250,000 people gathered to demand jobs and freedom. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act in 1965. These weren't inevitable. They happened because we'd forced the crisis, made neutrality impossible, raised the cost of maintaining segregation above the cost of ending it. But I also saw the limits of what the letter had accomplished. The white moderate didn't vanish. He adapted. He acknowledged that legal segregation was wrong, then opposed the measures needed to remedy its effects. He supported voting rights in principle, then opposed federal enforcement. He praised nonviolence, then condemned every form of protest that actually disrupted anything. The lie evolved. It became, you've achieved legal equality, what more do you want? As if laws alone created justice. As if ending official segregation eliminated the poverty, discrimination, and inequality it had produced. I watched this evolution with a weariness I hadn't felt when I wrote the letter. Then I believed that exposing the mechanism would weaken it, and it had. But power adapts. It finds new language, new justifications, new ways to make injustice seem reasonable. By 1967, I was speaking out against the Vietnam War. The criticism I received from white moderates sounded familiar. I was being divisive, they said. I was straying from my lane. I should focus on civil rights, not foreign policy. I should build consensus, not alienate allies. The same logic, the same call for patience, the same insistence that demanding justice on one front required silence on another. The lie had simply shifted domain. I thought about the letter often during those years, about what it had accomplished and what it hadn't. It had given people language to understand what they were experiencing. It had made the moderates' position harder to maintain comfortably. It had shown how moral-sounding arguments could serve immoral ends. But it hadn't created the change by itself. The letter worked because it explained what people were already seeing, gave framework to what they were already feeling, provided vocabulary for what they were already resisting. The real work was still the same work it had always been: organizing, marching, risking, suffering, making the cost of injustice visible, refusing to accept delay as wisdom, building movements that force change rather than waiting for change to be granted. I never regretted publishing the letter, but I came to understand it differently than I had when I wrote it. In that jail cell, I thought I was writing to convince the 8 clergymen, or at least to convince moderates reading over their shoulders. I thought that if I could just explain clearly enough, they'd see their error and change their position. That was naive. People don't abandon comfortable positions because of arguments. They abandon them when maintaining those positions becomes more costly than changing. What the letter actually did was give tools to those already committed to change. It helped them understand what they were fighting. It validated their impatience with calls for patience. It showed them that the obstacles they faced weren't accidents, but mechanisms, not confusion, but strategy. The letter's life after Birmingham taught me something about how change works. It's not linear. It's not a matter of convincing enough people and then achieving victory. It's a constant struggle where every gain must be defended, where power constantly adapts to new circumstances, where the same battles get fought in new forms. The white moderate I described in 1963 still exists. He's evolved his language, updated his arguments, found new ways to oppose change while claiming to support it. A lie that time heals injustice persists, just wearing different clothes. But the letter persists too. It gets rediscovered by each generation facing the same fundamental dynamics. Young activists read it and recognize the patterns they're experiencing. People resisting injustice find in it an explanation for the frustration they feel when allies counsel patience. That's what it means for the letter to have exposed the lie. Not that the exposure eliminated it, but that it made the lie nameable, recognizable, harder to mistake for wisdom. I don't know what will happen to the letter in years to come, whether it will continue to speak to people or become a historical artifact, interesting but not urgent, whether the patterns it describes will remain relevant or become obsolete. But I know what I learned from writing it, from the response to it, from watching it live beyond its original moment. I learned that the biggest obstacles to justice are often the people who claim to support it, that the language of moderation often serves to preserve extreme, that calls for patience are usually calls for surrender disguised as prudence. I learned that exposing these dynamics doesn't eliminate them, but it does make them harder to deploy invisibly. It raises the cost of claiming moderate ground while serving the status quo. I learned that change requires making people uncomfortable, forcing choices they'd prefer to avoid, creating situations where neutrality becomes impossible. And I learned that truth-telling matters even when it doesn't immediately change mine. Because while it might not convince those invested in the lie, it validates those who've already recognized it and gives them language to resist it. The letter from Birmingham jail was my attempt to name what I'd seen, to expose the mechanism that sustained injustice while claiming to oppose it, to show why patience with oppression was itself a form of oppression. It accomplished what it could. It gave tools to those fighting for justice. It made the moderate's position harder to maintain comfortably. It created a reference point for recognizing and resisting the lie that time alone heals injustice. But the work continues. The lie adapts. The moderate finds new language. The system evolves new mechanisms for preserving itself while appearing to change. That's the nature of the struggle. Not a single battle to be won, but a constant vigilance. Not a lie to be eliminated once and for all, but a pattern to be recognized and resisted in each new form it takes. The letter was one tool in that ongoing work, important, useful, but not sufficient, never sufficient, because in the end, words expose lies, but only action dismantles the systems those lies protect. I wrote the letter knowing it would cost me politically, personally, socially, and it did. But those costs were worth paying for the clarity it brought, for the framework it provided, for the way it helped people understand what they were fighting and why patience was surrender. America's biggest lie wasn't that segregation was good. It was that segregation would end naturally if everyone just remained calm and patient and reasonable. That lie had sustained oppression for a century. It had allowed good people to do nothing while claiming virtue. It had made injustice comfortable by insisting that those who protested it, not those who perpetrated it, were the problem. The letter exposed that lie for what it was. Not wisdom, but evasion. Not prudence, but complicity. Not patience, but capitulation. And though the lie persists in new forms, though the work continues, though justice remains incomplete, at least now the mechanism is visible. At least now we have language for what we're seeing. At least now the moderate can't hide behind claims of neutrality quite as easily. That's what the letter accomplished. Not victory, but clarity. Not the end of the struggle, but better tools for continuing it. And in a fight that spans generations, clarity matters. Tools matter. Language matters. They don't guarantee success, but they make success possible. That's enough. It has to be enough, because the work continues with or without guarantees until justice is no longer something we wait for, but something we live.